Thank you, Erwin. Happy Sabbath, everyone. I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my experiences during the 2 years I spent as a missionary in the Philippines. Now, a lot of times when missionaries give talks, they like to wear the costume of whatever country they worked in. Well, in my case, among the tribe I was working with, well, now it's common to wear shorts and a t-shirt, but traditionally, men would wear a loincloth. It's a little cold for that tonight, so I decided to wear this suit instead.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'd like to start by answering a question I get asked a lot, and that is, how did you decide to become a missionary? It's actually something that I thought about most of my life. I grew up reading mission stories, reading Him magazine, and there was always this thought in my mind that someday I might be a missionary as well. And that thought stayed with me all the way through high school and until it came time to choose a college major. And I had a lot of interests, but one thing that stood out to me was engineering. I really enjoyed math and science, and engineering seemed like a good fit. Well, I kept considering it anyway, and the summer before my senior year of high school, my family visited Andrews University and talked with several of the faculty there, and we had an appointment with some of the faculty from the Department of Engineering. And we had a very interesting conversation. We were just talking about my interests and goals, and they asked me what I wanted to do, and I sort of hesitantly mentioned mission work. And these two gentlemen just lit up. They were thrilled to hear that I was interested in mission work. The chair of the department, Dr. Agoki, he started speaking very enthusiastically about the need for engineers in the mission field and how they can use their skills to meet people's needs and reach them in that way. And he even went so far as to say that if health ministry is the right arm of the gospel, engineering should be the left arm. I'm not sure you'll find that in the spirit of prophecy, but he was certainly very enthusiastic about it. And so that started to help reassure me that, yes, this was a viable career path for a missionary. And as time went on, I realized that not only could the engineering degree be used sort of in a stereotypical mission sense of using it to reach people's needs as a bridge for the gospel, but also just having a degree, especially in a field like engineering, is very helpful for getting into a lot of countries where you otherwise might not be able to serve as a missionary. So I enrolled in Andrews, and I proceeded with my engineering studies. And as time went on, I started to lose that missions focus. I still talked about being a missionary someday, but I wasn't really doing anything to move myself in that direction. I was, if anything, preparing myself for more of a conventional career in the States. And that went on until my senior year. There was a series of circumstances that I went through and some things that happened in my life that sort of shook me up a little bit and got me to refocus my priorities. And I decided if I'm going to, if I'm serious about being a missionary, I should do something about it. So after I graduated, I decided to take a year off, and I signed on with Adventist Frontier Missions. And the place where I went to, you can see on the map here, it's the island of Palawan in the Philippines. Here's a closer shot of it. So you can see we have the Sulu Sea in the southeast, and the South China Sea on the other side. It's a very, very beautiful island. It's been called the most beautiful island in the world. And they have a number of popular resorts. That's not where I was working. I wasn't a missionary to the resorts, but I did get to visit some of them, and it is a very beautiful island. So in the more populated areas of the island, in the cities, most of the people are immigrants or descendants of immigrants from other parts of the Philippines, from the Visayas or from other islands. And so they're kind of more mainstream Filipinos. But up in the mountains, there are still pockets of indigenous tribal groups. And one of them is a group of people sometimes referred to as the Palawano, but they call themselves simply Palawan. And so they live near the southern end of the island around the town of Brooks Point. And many of them live up in the mountains, kind of secluded from the rest of the population. So AFM has been in that area for many years now, over 20 years. The missionaries there right now are Kent and Leanda George. They've been there for over 2 decades. And there have also been many other missionaries who have come and gone. They now have several others who are also there on a permanent basis. They've established several churches and also a few schools and a clinic to serve the native people of the island. Let's go to the next slide here. Here we go. So this is a helicopter belonging to another organization that works with AFM, PAMAS, the Philippine Adventist Medical Aviation Services. Some of you might know the man fueling the helicopter here. That's Daniel Louie. Some of you may know him. And so they would work with us at AFM. They would help us with medical evacuations or carrying supplies and so forth. This picture I took the day we arrived there in Palawan. This is down in the lowlands. They're fueling up the helicopter and getting it ready for a run. But we, the new missionaries, didn't get to take the helicopter up to the mountains. We got to take the trail, which is on the next slide. My ancient computer is not talking to the AV equipment here, so we're having to go kind of roundabout here. So this is a section of the trail hiking up into the mountains. It's about a 2-hour hike. Well, for some it's 3 or 4, or for some it's, for the natives, more like 45 minutes. But for the first time, 2 or 3 hours is about average. So we hiked up there. The next slide, I have a couple of views from the trail. The one on the left is looking out over the valley that we had come up from. You can see the lowlands there, and kind of on the edge, you can see the edge of the sea and the coastline there. On the picture on the right, it's hard to see from the angle, but that's actually looking down the trail. The trail is quite steep in some places, and you have to use your hands a little bit to get up the trail. So it's quite a fun hike. Maybe not what you'd want to do for a Sabbath afternoon excursion, although we did have to hike it on Sabbath sometimes. But I got to know that trail quite well, hiking in and out over the 2 years that I was there. Going on, the next slide shows us hiking down. So we've gone up the mountain, now we're going down the other side into Kamantian, which is the village where the Georges live. Now I say village, the Palawan people don't typically live in villages as we think of them. They tend to live in clusters of houses. Usually family groups will tend to stick together. But this particular area, Kamantian, is a little more built up. There are a few more families, a few more houses there. And that's where the Georges have been for their time there in the Philippines. That's where the center of their work is. And that's where they have the clinic and their main school and some of their other facilities there. So when we arrived, we arrived around dusk, and we were greeted with a wonderful, lovely pot of boiled cassava, which, if you're not used to it, tastes a little bland, but after you've had it for a while, it actually tastes pretty good. I learned to enjoy eating roots while I was there. The Palawan people eat a lot of roots. That's one of the main staples of their diet. They do grow rice, but most of them aren't able to grow enough to last through the entire year. And so they live a lot of the year on roots or whatever they can grow. And so they have a lot of different roots, a lot of different ways of preparing them. And this next slide shows some pictures I took during what they called boot camp. I think maybe they should have called it flip-flop camp because that's what we were wearing. But when the new missionaries arrived there, we went through a couple of weeks of cultural immersion, getting to know the culture, interacting with people, learning their way of life. This picture on the left shows some of them pounding rice. So this is part of the process of how they process their rice. They put it in this basin and pound it to break off the husk. On the right is some kids playing. Turns out you don't need snow to go sledding. A muddy hill works just fine. On the next slide, I have a picture of a typical Palawan rice field. The variety of rice that they grow does not need to be in standing water. They'll just plant it on the hillside, and that's how they grow it. Their year, their calendar, so to speak, is the rice cycle. Traditionally, they don't really need to keep track of time the way that we're used to, but their year pretty much revolves around planting and harvesting their rice. I have a video here on the next slide. I'll see if it'll play. This is 4 people pounding rice in one basin, which takes a bit of coordination. Let's see if it'll play here. There we go. With sound, you can hear the rhythm of them pounding together. I have heard that you can get up to 5 people doing this at once. I have not been able to see 5 people doing it, but I got to see 4 people doing it, which was pretty impressive. I've tried doing it myself. If you get past about 2 or 3, the coordination starts to get a little bit tricky. But these guys are pretty skilled at it. They literally do it for a living. All right, next slide. Our main job in those first few weeks was to get started learning the language. Now, a lot of people, when they find out I was in the Philippines, they ask me if I speak Tagalog. And the answer is not really. I also don't speak Visayan or any of the other common Filipino languages. I speak an obscure dialect that no one's ever heard of called Palawan. And the reason is because, well, that's their language. And it's important to be able to speak to people in their language, especially when you want to communicate important truth, like the gospel, because you want to be able to reach their heart. And some of them may understand Tagalog, and they might be able to intellectually understand the message, but if you really want to speak to someone's heart, you use their language. So that was our main task for the first several weeks, was to get immersed in the language. We had some help for a week or so. One of the locals helped us with a few basic phrases, and then we were sent off to go visiting and to learn the language by interacting with people. In this picture, you'll see me with 2 fine young men. The picture that was there already. Yes, this one, thank you. So the man in the purple shirt is old enough to remember watching Japanese planes fly over the valley. And so, as you can imagine, he has a lot of stories to tell. He was just a few years ago became a Christian, and so he has quite a testimony of his conversion story. So it was always a delight to go to his house and spend some time visiting with him, getting to practice the language, getting to hear some stories, and both of us were happy after the visit. The man in the green shirt is his cousin, who for a while lived in another area farther away, but he had some health issues and came to live with him. And the other man, Mantapang, was helping his cousin with his health and also sharing about Jesus. And so that was really neat to see him sharing his new faith with his cousin. They actually called each other brothers. They were pretty close. And you can see they're both pretty happy people. Now we can go to the next picture. I got to meet some of the other inhabitants of the island as well. In case you can't tell, I'm the one in the red shirt. Yeah. So this was taken while we were on a camp out with some of the kids from our school there. All right, next slide. So when I originally went to, or when I signed up with AFM to go to the Philippines, I signed up to be a math teacher. That was the job description that I signed up for. And I did actually get to teach math and science and English and computers. And that's how it works in the mission field. You get to do whatever is needed, and even if it's not what you signed up for. So I got to teach a number of subjects as well as taking on some other tasks. So this is me in the classroom. I believe this is my English class. And it was a bit challenging at first because I had to start teaching within just a few weeks of arriving. It was about a month or a month and a half, and I had to start teaching. And as you can imagine, my language skills were not very strong yet. Just imagine trying to teach algebra when you're still learning how to count. It's a bit tricky. Thankfully, I had some students who understood some English, and they were able to help a little bit until my language skills improved. But education is a valuable thing. And for a lot of these students, education is an opportunity that they may not have had just a few short years ago. Many of their parents don't know how to read or write. Some of them do, but many of them are the first in their family to get an education. And so those who do place a high value on it. They appreciate the chance to be able to learn and to study. So we have, there in Kamantian, we have an elementary school. There's also a high school. The elementary school is pretty large. A lot of parents will send their kids there to learn to read and write. The high school is a bit smaller. That tends to be just those who really want to learn more will go on to the high school. So I had a lot of good experiences there as a teacher. Now, I also had some other jobs that I did not expect. One was assistant boys dean. And the next slide shows our dorm facilities. This A-frame on the left, that was built as a temporary structure about 5 years ago. It's been needed to be replaced many times, and they always find some way to prop it up and keep it going for another year. They really need new facilities, but so far they haven't been able to get those built. On the right there is the dean's residence, which is a little bit nicer, thankfully. And so that's where I lived during my time there. I was the assistant boys dean for the first year, and in my second year I was the head dean because the other head dean left. So I got to be a boys dean, which is not something I would have signed up for. I never would have wanted to be a boys dean. Even now, I'm pretty sure I would not sign up to be a boys dean, but I got to experience it anyway. The next slide shows the boys' cooking area. That's where they prepared their meals and ate. Next one shows where they would bathe. There's a bamboo trough leading from the creek to this bucket here, and that's where they would do their bathing. Next slide shows a creek We would have to cross this creek to get from the dorm to the school. This is also where I got to witness one of our students performing a circumcision on some of his classmates. It's a bit of a coming of age thing for them over there. I don't have any pictures of that. I'm sorry. So you'll just have to, you don't have to imagine it, but it was quite interesting to say the least. The next slide shows our high school building from the outside, and after that, the next slide shows the elementary school building, which also served as the church building. So that's where people would gather every Sabbath and have the church services. Let's see. All right, on the next slide we have an outdoor classroom. This is where some of our classes were taught. This is also where I got to teach Sabbath school. I had only been there about 4 months when the previous Sabbath school teacher, Carrie, she had been a student missionary, and she was going career, as we say. So she was getting ready to be a career missionary, so she had to go back to the States to do some fundraising and training, and someone needed to take over the junior Sabbath school. I didn't want that to be me, but it ended up being me anyway. And that was challenging because my language skills were still not all that solid, but we managed. The kids were very patient and helpful. And through doing that, even though I didn't feel comfortable with it, that actually helped my abilities to grow. I was able to learn the language better by pushing myself to use it. And I got to have a lot of good interactions with the kids there in that Sabbath school class. This next slide shows the clinic. I have a little medical clinic there staffed by nurses. People come from all over the area to get treatment, whether it's for injuries or for sickness. Malaria is still pretty common over there. I even had it once. So we get a lot of people who come here, and the clinic is a really good way to reach the community and to show God's love to them through the service that these nurses provide for the people. This next slide, there's a little hut. It doesn't look like much, but it illustrates something about the culture. This is a little cookhouse for the families of people in the clinic. Now, in the Philippines, when you're sick, you don't go and stay in the hospital by yourself. You have someone with you. And so this is the cookhouse for their families. So the families of those who were sick would do their cooking, make their meals there, while they were waiting on their loved one who had to stay in the clinic. Well, my first year went by pretty quickly, and it came time to decide whether I was going to go back to the States or stay another year. And I thought about it and prayed about it, and one of the things that came to mind was the knowledge that a missionary is much more effective the second year than the first year, because that second year you already know the language, you know the culture, you're starting to know how things work, and so you have the potential to be much more effective. And I had made a lot of friends and wanted to keep building on those relationships and keep working on my language skills. I figured I spent a year learning this language, I might as well use it. I'm not going to use it anywhere else, so why not here? So after extensive prayer, I decided to stay for a second year. And let's go to the next slide. And the next slide. Okay. So the second year, I took on a lot of new responsibilities. As I mentioned earlier, I became the head boys dean. which was quite the experience. I got a lot of time bonding with these young men, watching them grow and mature, some of them faster than others. And I learned a lot through that experience of deaning and taking leadership and helping to give them direction and mentorship. It was also a year of a lot of things happening for the school. We were in the process of accreditation. Now, this school had been operating for many years unaccredited, but in recent years, there had been some individuals within the government who were trying to shut down the school. And so it was decided that it would be best to try to seek accreditation that would give the school more legitimacy, and it would be harder for someone to try to shut us down. So that year, we were going through a lot of the legal process of getting our school registered and accredited. I'm sure a lot of people here can relate to that process. I wasn't directly involved with handling the bureaucracy, but I did have to help with some of the paperwork and so forth. And there was a lot going on. But eventually, we did get a permit to operate, which was the next step towards being recognized by the government. So we were thankful for that, and that we were able to do so while still keeping our principles as a Christian school. Another challenge that came up during that time, so there were the legal challenges of the school. There were also spiritual challenges. During that time, we had one of our students in the elementary school, a girl by the name of Karin, who began exhibiting some strange behavior. And her dean was watching her and noticed some things that were a little off. Some of the other nurses were observing her, and they came to the conclusion that she was demon-possessed. Now, I know there are a lot of people who would say, well, that's not possession, that's psychosis, or that's some psychiatric illness. And there certainly are psychiatric things that can happen. But I think a lot of times the spiritual and the psychiatric go together. It's kind of hard to separate them. And there were definite signs of something spiritual going on. So that was quite a trying time for us, for the missionaries, especially for the girls, because they were the ones who had to stay with her and keep an eye on her. It wasn't appropriate for the guys to sit with her through the night. So most of the burden of taking care of her fell on the girls. And so they were quite tired and exhausted, and the guys were too, because we were also involved, although not as fully as they were. So we spent a lot of time in prayer and fasting, and after about 10 days, she started acting normally again. But then a few weeks later, she fell back into it. It reminds me of what Jesus said, when an unclean spirit has gone out, what does he do? He comes back and finds the room empty, and then he goes and takes 7 other more wicked than himself, and they enter in and dwell there. And the last state is worse than the first. And so she fell back into this state, and so we would gather every night and sing and pray and continue with fasting and prayer. And it was a trying time for many of us. I know even myself, there were times when I would start to feel this almost like a cloud of oppression just pressing down on me. And it was a reminder of our need to be solidly anchored to Christ. And we need to have that connection, because we don't know when the enemy will attack. And even if the attack is focused on someone else, we can still feel the effects of it. Thankfully, she was eventually healed, restored to her right mind. But there's still a sad component of that story. Her father was an elder in one of our churches there. He was actually a former witch doctor. I know that term's not politically correct, but it's accurate. So He was a former witch doctor who had converted and was an elder in the church. And during this time when his daughter was having this illness, this strange behavior, he tried some of his traditional medicine on her to try to bring her out of it. And we didn't know about this until after the fact. She ended up getting better, but then he started behaving erratically. And as far as I know, he hasn't been back in his right mind since then. So it's a sad reminder that even though we have chosen Christ, we still need to be on guard against falling back into our old ways. So that was quite a trying experience for us missionaries there. But I also had another set of responsibilities that I gained that came the second year. So I mentioned our head dean left. That was my roommate Brendan. So he had been the head boys dean, so I took over from him. But he also had another job, and that was that he would go every weekend to another location called Umrung, and he would preach there and lead out a group there. Now, Umrung was a place where missionaries had been going for several years. There weren't any baptized members there yet, but there was a small group of people who were interested in Christianity, and they would gather every week. And Brendan would go there every Sabbath and lead a Bible study and prayer and singing with them. The next slide here shows a man from Umrung. And Brendan, before he left, he built a building, which you can see on the next slide. He built this building to serve as a church building as well as a school and a clinic. It was kind of a multi-purpose building. So he built that for the people of Umrung. And so when Brendan left, I took over and started going there every week to work with these people. This next slide shows us in church one Sabbath morning. Umrung was a bit of a learning curve for me in a number of ways. They're a little more isolated, a little more remote than Kamantian. In Kamantian, they have a little more influence from the lowlands. They're starting to get a little more sophisticated. But Umrung is farther out, and there's still a lot more primitive there. Also, there are some differences in the language. With the Palawano language, there are, of course, many sub-dialects, and in some places you can go just a few miles over and you can't understand the language. Now, that's not quite the case with Umrung. Their language was still close enough. It was mostly the same, but they did have a few words that were different, and so there's a bit of a learning curve in adjusting to that. So I would go there every Sabbath and hold meetings with them and go visiting in the afternoons. And we wanted to have a school there as well. And that second year, we actually had 2 missionaries come who were nurses, and they were going to go to Umrung to open a school and a clinic. But they weren't quite ready to go yet. They still had to go through the process of language and culture learning, getting trained in the clinic and everything. And so it was going to be a number of months before they were able to actually go and start the school. So I had an idea, well, maybe I could teach a little bit. Well, I was still teaching in Kamantian during the week, but I thought, well, maybe when I go on Sabbath, I'll just stay over until Sunday morning, and I'll teach for a little bit on Sunday morning and then hike back. It was about a 2-hour hike. So I started doing that. I would stay Sunday morning and try to teach little kids how to read. And I must say I have a whole new respect for elementary teachers. It was, yeah. So, some of them got the alphabet down pretty well, but then you start trying to get them to read words, and it just, yeah. It was a challenge, but it was fun too. Another interesting challenge, just because of how isolated they are, came from when we were trying to get them registered as students. Now, to be legally registered in school, you need to have a birth certificate. That's a problem for these kids, because they didn't have birth certificates. So we had to fill out the paperwork for them to receive their birth certificates, and that was a problem too. They don't have the same kind of concept of keeping track of time as we do. I remember once I was talking to one couple, and I asked the wife, "So how long have you and your husband been married?" She said, "I don't know. Maybe since 2004. And I thought, wow, this is not in America. They have a very different concept of keeping track of time, even more so here in Amrung. So I would ask the parent, "So how old was your child?" "I don't know." "Well, like, when were they born?" "Oh, that was a long time ago." "Well, was it morning or evening?" Well, they could remember that much they would know. "Do you know what month it was?" "Nope." "Had you planted your rice yet?" "No, we were still clearing the fields." "Okay, I can work with that." That narrows it down to about a month. So we ended up making up some of the details for these birth certificates. There's quite a bit of guesswork involved. Sometimes to figure out how old someone was, we'd ask, "Well, how much older is this? Which is older, this one or this one?" "Okay, this one's older." "Okay, and this one looks like maybe they're about 5. "Okay." Yeah, not an exact science. But we were able to get the information, or invent the information for their birth certificates, so we could get them registered as students. All right, next slide. This is a house in a little area near Amrung. It's a little ways up the hill. It's an area called Tirungan. So one Sabbath afternoon in Amrung, I was out visiting people, and this girl, the one here in the purple shirt, she came to me with her grandmother and said, "Do you want to visit our place?" And I said, "Sure." So I went with her up the hill to their little area there in Tirungan. It's a really nice place. Has a nice view of the mountains and the Sulu Sea. In fact, I was there one evening, and this girl pointed on the sea. There was a light, probably from a boat or something. So she pointed to the light and she asked me, "Is that light close to America?" So it just gives you an idea of how isolated they are in these villages. They don't have a concept of how big the world is. Anyway, so I went to visit this area up there in Tirungan. And another Sabbath when I was there, I went up to visit again and just spend some time with the people. Most of them weren't the kind who would normally come to our church services. But I would go visit them anyway. So a lot of the kids would come, but not so much the adults. But one day I was visiting, and I was getting ready to leave, and they said, "What, you mean you're not sleeping here?" And I thought they were just being nice, but no, they were serious. They said, "Next time you come, bring your blanket and sleep here." And so I said, "Okay." And so I did. The next time I went there, I stayed with them. I stayed with one of the local elders there. His name was either Dirkino or Dulkino. I've heard it both ways. But he invited me to stay there in his house. He had a larger house there where I could stay. And so I started going there, and I would stay the night there. And in the evenings, we would have Bible stories and songs with the children. And sometimes the adults would sit around and listen too. And the man, Dulkino, he would kind of sit in the back and listen, and every now and then he'd offer a comment or two. One evening he said, "Why don't we tell you a Palawan story?" And I thought, oh wow, this sounds interesting. And so he told the story. He had to tell it a few times before I understood it. He was using some less common words. Storytellers, they do that. And some of the others had to help with using more common words that I actually knew. But the story, it was quite an interesting story. It was something like this. It said there was once a little boy whose parents had died. And so he and his older sibling lived with their uncle. And this uncle was not a kind man. He was very cruel to the little boy. He made him sleep under the house with the pigs and the chickens. He wouldn't even let him come up to eat. And so the boy had to survive on whatever scraps fell through the cracks in the floor. And of course, the chickens were competition for the grains of rice or whatever else might have fallen down. And of course, anytime someone swept the floor or rinsed a dish, the dirt would fall and splatter on the boy. And so he had a really miserable life. Well, one night, the boy had a dream. And in this dream, a man said to him, "You must flee from your uncle. If you don't flee, you will die." So the next morning, the boy woke up and he knew what he had to do. So he snuck away from his uncle's house and ran far away until he came to the house of a strong man. The strong man took him in and was kind to him and raised him as his own. So Dukino finished telling the story, and he sat there for a moment, and then he said, "I think the strong man is God." And I said, "I think you're right." It's interesting how these stories, they're not biblical stories, but even these traditional stories can have truth built into them. And so that was really neat to be able to hear that traditional story from their culture. One evening, Dokino asked me, "Do you want to go visiting?" And I said, "Sure." So he took me around the corner to this house that you see in this picture here. And he introduced me to his daughter and son-in-law and their new baby. And the baby was probably a few weeks old. I don't think anyone kept a record. But he said to me, "She doesn't have a name yet. So, we can't think of a name for her, so why don't you name her?" He said, "You're good at that." Like, how does he know? Never named a kid before. So I said, "Well, can I think about it?" And he said, "Oh, sure. So I thought about it that night, and the next morning I asked the parents, "So what do you think about Hadassah?" They said, "Oh, that's a nice name. Yeah, that's her name. That's her name, Hadassah." And so I told them the story behind the name, and they really liked it. They thought it was a great name. Of course, none of them wrote it down. So I've heard people call her Hadassah. Some people call her Harasa. Some people Dasa. But she has a name, which is more than she had before. They were just calling her the girl before. And so now at least she has a name. That's her there in the little bundle. That girl in the orange shirt who's holding her, believe it or not, that's her mother. She doesn't look old enough to be a mother, but she is a mother. And so that's her little girl Hadassah there. So I don't have any children of my own, but there's one that I named in the mountains of Palawan. So that was a neat experience. So this girl on the right in the purple shirt, her name's Bina. And then on the other side, kind of standing toward the back in the gray, that's Bibi, her cousin. So like I said earlier, Bina was the one who first brought me up to this area and introduced me to it. She was one of the people who would come every week to church, and she would sing the songs enthusiastically. When we started a school, she would come to that as well, and she was excited about learning. She had a very strong personality. If I had to guess her age, I would say maybe 13 or so. Her cousin, Bibi, is a little bit older. Now, Bibi was rather reserved. She was shy, didn't really want to talk much. If she said something and I didn't understand, she would just kind of shrink back and cover her face and not say anything. Bina, on the other hand, if I didn't understand something she said, she would repeat herself louder and faster in the hopes that I would get it. It usually didn't work, but anyway. So eventually, the other two missionaries were ready to move out to Amrung and to start the school. The names were Talise and Samantha. They were both there that second year that I was there. And so they came to live there in Amrung and to teach school. And this was around the beginning of the year, so about January. And so Bina and her cousin Bibi both attended the school, and they were both excited and enthusiastic about learning. But it wasn't too long before the girls started to notice that Bina wasn't acting like herself. And it soon became clear that she was getting quite sick, and there was quite possibly a spiritual component as well. But there was also a physical illness. At first, the nurses suspected malaria, but they weren't sure. She kept getting worse. Things were looking strange. Now, they didn't have much medical equipment with them there in Amrung, so they told Bina and her family, you need to go to Kamantian, to the clinic, and get this checked out, because something bad is going on. You need to get this taken care of. Well, Bina didn't want to go to the clinic, and her family didn't really want her to either. So she stayed there in Amrung, and she kept getting worse and worse. And one weekend, I went there on Friday afternoon, and I was talking with Talise and Samantha, and they said, Bina is really sick. She can barely walk, and she hasn't been to school or anything. Well, so that evening, when I went up to the village to go to bed, I saw her. She was sitting, moaning, and not in a good condition at all. It was clear she needed medical attention, but her family still didn't want to take her to Kamantian. Well, the next morning was a church. So Bibi, her cousin, stayed with Bina while I went to church. And then later, after church, I went back. Talise came with me, one of the nurses, to check on Bina and see how she was doing. She was not doing well. It's clear that her condition was very serious, and it might already be too late, but at the very least, she needed to get to medical help right away. And so Talise was telling anyone who would listen, she needs to get to Kamantian. Now, her father was out working in his field, and he didn't want to come in and talk, and he didn't want to carry her, didn't want anyone else to carry her either. Talise tried to tell them, and finally she said, if she doesn't get help soon, she's going to die. And that was kind of a stark statement, and I looked over at Bibi, her cousin, and could see she was reacting to this reality that was setting in, that this is serious. But her father still refused to take her to Kamantian. And Talise and Samantha had to go to Kamantian for something else. So they had to leave. They tried one more time to persuade the family to take her, but they wouldn't. So they left without her. And I stayed there because I was planning to stay the night there anyway. And as I stayed there, I watched her get worse throughout the afternoon. A few other people came in and tried some traditional rituals with her. in the times when she was conscious, she participated in the rituals, which was saddening for me. But I stayed there with them, and partway into the afternoon, Bibi, her cousin, asked me, can you check her pulse? I thought, well, okay, I mean, I don't know that will do much for her, but sure, I'll check. So her pulse was above 130 and very strong. And I didn't know if there was anything we could do. At this point, I was texting the nurses to ask, is there anything more we can do for her? Well, she really needed medical attention, and that had been refused. So there wasn't a whole lot left that we could do for her. Partway through the afternoon, I went outside and was just standing outside the house, just thinking. And I heard a noise come from inside the house. So I went inside, and I saw Bina's father lying on the floor in the fetal position, just wailing. And, well, Bina was still alive, but her father was here on the floor wailing. And another man was bending over him. He had a green sprig with leaves on it in his hand. He was holding it against Dulcino's head and blowing on it. And I thought, well, that's a little odd. I wonder what that's about. Well, after a minute or two, the father calmed down and stopped wailing, and he got up and went outside. And the other man came out to me and asked, did you understand that? I said, no. And the conversation after that, it's a little bit hard to translate, but what he said is something like, he's in anguish or in agony because of his child. And he asked, well, what was that with the leaves and you blowing on it? And he said that was to remind him of his human senses. Well, that didn't really explain much more to me, but that was that. And I wondered, why these demonstrations now when action a few hours ago might have actually helped her. But what else was there to do? A little later, I checked Bina's pulse again. It was still very fast, but not as strong as before. It was getting weaker. And the evening wore on, and it was time for bed. And so all of us gathered there in the room. It was a one-room house. And so the family was there. And it's traditional, it's customary, when someone is sick, the family members will take turns sitting up with them. And so people were taking turns throughout the night, sitting up to keep an eye on Bina. Well, about 4 in the morning, I woke up and I realized that everybody was sitting up and they were all facing Bina's bed. And someone had pulled her blanket over her head. And so I was sitting there looking at this, and someone asked me, Michael, do you understand? And, well, of course I understood. And they said, her breath is gone. See for yourself. And it's strange, the compulsions we humans have sometimes. Of course I knew they were telling the truth, but I had to check anyway. So I approached the bed, and sure enough, her breath was gone. And I knew, even before I reached for her cold wrist, that this time I would find no pulse. It's wonderful when we hear stories of miracles and God's intervention in answer to prayer. We need to hear those stories, but I think we also need to hear the stories of when there is no miracle and when the answer to our prayers isn't what we thought it would be, because God is still there. Well, I set up with the family for the rest of the morning, and as the daylight came, people started to come from the surrounding areas. They were starting to gather and to prepare for the burial process. So some of the men went to dig a grave. Some of the women started gathering some of Bina's things when they bury their dead, they bury them with a few items. So some clothes, maybe a pot, maybe a few coins, a little bit of food. And so they were gathering some of these items and preparing for the burial. And the Palauan don't really show grief that much. You don't really see them crying in public very much. Now, some of the women did cry, especially her cousin, some of the other women. They cried a little bit, but then they calmed down and just kind of sat sadly. None of the men cried. They just kind of sat around watching, except for one, her father. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but he had also lost his wife at some point prior to this, and now his daughter as well. And so he was sitting outside the house, just sitting on, squatting and rocking back and forth and wailing. And no one was sitting with him. All the other men were just kind of hanging back off to themselves. Now, when Christians grieve, when Christians mourn their loved ones, we see grief, we see sadness, we see pain. But as I watched this man wailing, I saw despair. I saw hopelessness. Because he didn't have the hope that we have, the resurrection. So as I watched him sitting there, I saw there was no one else sitting next to him. So I went and squatted on the ground next to him and put my arm across his shoulder and then wondered, what do I say? The apostle says, comfort one another with these words, words of hope in the resurrection at Jesus' second coming. But would Bina be there? I didn't know. She came to church, but she was still, she was participating in these rituals. Was that just because she didn't understand or because she hadn't made her decision? I don't know the answer, and thankfully I don't have to know the answer. I know that we serve a God who is just and merciful, yes, and he will make the right decision. But what do I say to this grieving father in the moment? Well, for a few minutes I didn't say anything, and then I just softly said, her pain is over now. And that started him talking. He started talking about how terrible this life is, how horrible it is. First his wife, and now his child, and there's so much death and pain and suffering in this world. And so I agreed with him. Yes, there is so much evil in this world, but God wants to make a new earth. And I shared with him how God wants to recreate the world, and he wants us to be his children so that we can share that new earth with him. I don't know how much he processed or absorbed from that, but he seemed calmer after that. And so I sat with him a little longer while the other men finished digging the grave. And then it came time for the burial. They had prepared the grave, and now they needed to take the body from the house to the gravesite. Now, she had died sometime before 4 o'clock that morning, and it was now late morning or early afternoon. Remember, this is in a tropical climate, so it was not moving the body was not a pleasant task. No one was looking forward to it, but everyone pointed at me to be one of the people to move the body. And then, they said, he can't do it by himself, so who's going to help him? So eventually a few other people stepped forward, and we picked up the body. There's no coffin or anything. She was just wrapped in some cloth. And we moved her to the grave. They buried her, and they have an interesting way of doing their graves. They don't have a coffin, but the graves do have a floor and walls. So they'll dig the grave, then they'll put down a makeshift floor and walls and lay the body on top, and then they'll cover it and fill it in. The next slide shows the finished grave site there. So they finished the burial, and then we all went back up toward the house. And I had observed one Palauan burial before this, so I knew what was coming next. Everyone who participated in the burial was supposed to line up, and then one of the witch doctors there had a bowl of water and some leaves in his hand, and he would dip the leaves in the bowl of water, and then brush the water across the hands of the people who had helped in the burial. It was like a blessing or a cleansing. In some ways, it almost reminded me of the first Passover, but of course, it wasn't anything like that at all. So several people were urging me to join the line and you stand in line and receive the blessing. Of course, I said no. I declined. I said, "Oh, just stand in line, and it'll be fine." And I said, "No." They have enough confusion about spiritual things as it is without the Christian missionary receiving the witch doctor's blessing. So I just stood and watched, and one of them said, "So you are going to bathe, right?" And, yeah, I'll take a bath. Yeah, I will do that, but I'm not going to participate in this ritual. So that was one of the low points of my time there, but it turned into an opportunity. We Adventists like to quote Ecclesiastes 9:5 in our evangelistic series and Bible studies. For the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything. And we use that to show that when you're dead, you're dead and asleep. And that is true, but that's not all we can get from that verse. If we back up to the verse before that, in verse 4, the writer says, "But to him that is joined to all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion." He says, for the living there is hope. Why? Because the living know that they shall die. Having an awareness of our mortality means that we have hope. We can take this as a reminder for how we should be prepared and how we should be ever seeking to be closer to God. And so this turned out to be an opportunity for Bina's family who was left behind. I noticed that after this, her father seemed much more open to spiritual things. He even came to church once or twice, which was not something he would have done before. Her cousin as well and other family members had a chance to practice trusting in God. Because in their culture, it's an animistic culture, and they grew up with a fear of the spirits and a fear of the ghosts of dead relatives. And I remember one evening after this happened, Bibi was preparing food or something, and there was a noise outside. And she kind of started, and someone said, "Oh, that's a ghost." And she was a bit shaken by that. Some people say, we don't need to worry too much about doctrine, just love people. Well, sometimes the best way you can love someone is to tell them the truth. Mm-hmm. And we had talked about death before and what it was, but here was an opportunity when it was relevant, when it's right there in front of you, when it's the question you're asking now. And so I just shared with them again, there's no ghost walking around to scare you or haunt you. And we don't have to be afraid of the darkness. Fear is a big part of an animistic culture, fear of the spirits. And that was one thing, not just in this situation, but throughout my time there, being able to share with people that we don't have to be afraid of the spirits or the ghosts or the darkness. There are a lot of songs that have been translated into their language. One of them is a scripture song by Steve Green, "When I'm Afraid, I Will Trust in You." And they love singing that song. Yan magtakutku mangandalku dimu, mangandalku dimu, mangandalku dimu. And they would sing that song, and it's just such a simple little song, but it was meaningful for them because they have a lot in their culture that gives them fear. But just that reminder, when I am afraid, I will trust in you. That was a great comfort to them. And especially to Bina, or to Bibi and the rest of the family after Bina's death. Well, as the months went on, it came closer to the time when I was leaving. This time I had decided not to stay for a third year. I had some other plans. I wasn't immediately planning to come to Weimar. That's a whole other story of how I ended up here. But I was planning to leave Palawan, and I was starting to wonder who's going to take over from me when I leave. Talise and Samantha, the teachers there, they were only there for 1 year, and then they went back to the States. And so I was wondering who's going to keep working with the people of Amrang after I leave. And I was praying about it. Sometimes I would feel a little bit guilty about leaving, just thinking if I leave them, who's going to keep working with them? But I remembered what Jesus said. He said, "Pray the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth laborers into his harvest." And I realized if the Lord of the harvest is sending you to a different part of the field, it's his business who he chooses to replace you. And so I went ahead with my plans, but still praying and still wondering who was going to take up this work after I left. Well, the answer came just a few weeks before I had to leave. If we could go to the next slide. One of the local elders in Kamantian, so he'd been a Christian for a number of years now, he volunteered to move to Amrang with his family to head up the school there and to disciple the church there. So this is not just another American missionary. This is one of their own people who said, "I want to go and share this message with my people." It's the best replacement I could have asked for. And it's not just him. He's there with his family. This picture was taken after I left. And that's him there in the green shirt sharing the word with the people of Amrang. And so I was thankful to see how God worked. I wouldn't have imagined that he would be the one to take over, but it was the perfect answer to that prayer. So now he's there with his family, ministering to his own people. And that's really is what every missionary's goal should be, is for the local people to take up the work themselves. And so I was incredibly grateful to see Nixon and his family doing that work. Well, even though there was happiness, there was also sadness because I still had to leave. And when I left, I was leaving behind friends. This next slide shows me with one of my friends, Mityan. He's a man who lived there in the Amrang area with his family. He and his family were among our most faithful attendees at our weekly services. This picture was taken my last Sabbath there in Amrang. Mityan's a fun guy. He likes to make jokes, and we had all kinds of fun together. Real fun guy. And he has a wife and 3 kids. So this was taken our last Sabbath there. On the next slide was when I went to visit him that afternoon. This is a house or a little shelter there next to his rice field. They have an interesting thing they do for their rice field, because there are birds that like to eat the rice. And so what they do is they set up a bamboo clapper, and they have a cord leading out to it. If you yank on the cord, it makes a noise, and that's supposed to scare the birds away. And so the other end of that cord usually will be under some kind of shelter, so they don't have to sit out there in the sun scaring away the birds. So that's where he and his wife were that afternoon. That's him. The next slide shows his wife there, TC. And so I went and sat with him, just visiting with them for a little while. And TC said something that really warmed my heart. She said, I have laundry to do, but I'm saving it for tomorrow. And that just made me happy. To see that there's some of these things that we're teaching them are starting to take root. She says, I want to honor the Sabbath. I'm going to save my laundry for tomorrow. So I visited with them for a while, and then it came time to leave, and TC, the wife, started crying and wiping her eyes and vigorously yanking on the cord to disguise how upset she was. And I got a little teary-eyed myself, and even Mithian, the husband, was sniffling a little when I left. It was bittersweet parting. I'm happy to have made these friends. They kept asking me if I was going to come visit them, and I gave the only honest answer I could. I would love to visit, but I don't know if it'll happen. I would like to go back someday and visit. Whether that's in God's plan, I don't know. We'll see. But I know they're in good hands in the meantime. And the people of Palawan will always be close to my heart and prayers. The title of my talk for tonight, Upon the Mountains, is taken from the verse that's on the next slide. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who proclaims peace, who brings glad tidings of good things, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. There were a lot of times when my feet did not feel very beautiful upon those mountains. They'd get smelly and dirty and dry and cracked and all kinds of things. I don't have pictures of that either. But I knew that I was playing a part in bringing good news to the people of these mountains of Palawan. And that's something that we all have the privilege of participating in. Each one of us is tasked to bring good news, whether that's to those around us or to those abroad. And there is still a great need, not just in Palawan, but around the world, for missionaries who are willing to leave behind their comforts and go to those who are living in fear and darkness and bring them the good news. If we could go to the next slide. Adventist Frontier Missions, that's the organization I went with. I have the website there. If you sense God calling you to take some time to serve as a missionary, come talk to me. I can give you an interest form and a list of current calls for missionaries. If you're about to graduate and not sure what you're doing next year, what could be better than sharing the good news? If you're in the middle of your education, you can take a year off and come back, and it'll help you refocus your mission and God's calling for your life. Even if you're long out of school, it's not too late. There's still a place for you. So Adventist Frontier Missions always has openings. There are other organizations as well. I put a few on the slide. The contrast is not as good here as it was on my laptop, but the last one at the bottom is Jesus for Asia. I'm not affiliated with any of them except AFM, but I know people who work with all those organizations. And there are others as well. So I would encourage you to prayerfully consider where God might be leading you and what he can do through you. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for the opportunity to share what you have done in the mountains of Palawan. I thank you that you have chosen to use us as channels for your love to flow to the perishing. Lord, I pray that you will be with each one of us, that we will continue to seek your will for our lives and continue to seek where you may be calling us to serve you. And I pray this in Jesus' name, amen.